the Rock and Roll Unravelled Show.
I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. Now we're looking at the Atlantic Records story, one of the most influential record labels ever. And we're looking at it right from the beginning, the 90s and 40s and 50s, when they were very much into R&B and doo-wop. The 60s, they became synonymous with soul music, really interesting association with Stax. And the mid-60s and 70s, they embraced rock and roll. Well, to get us in the mood, one of the great Atlantic R&B vocal groups of the 1950s and early 1960s, although they actually released their singles on Atlantic's sister label, Atco. It was a massive hit for them on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, it was very rare for American R&B groups in the 50s to find chart success in the UK, but the Coasters managed it 4 times in the late 1950s. This is the Coasters with Yakety Yak. The guiding light behind Atlantic Records was Ahmet Ertegun. He was born in Istanbul, in Turkey, in 1923 and moved to America when he was quite a young boy. And it was in 1947 when he formed Atlantic Records in New York with his friend Herb Abramson. Now, the first big hit for Atlantic came in early 1949 with Stick McGhee and his Buddies and a song called Drinking Wine as Spo-Dee-O-Dee. Interestingly enough, he'd recorded the song a couple of years earlier on the Harlem record label, and then it was credited to Stick McGhee and his Buddy. So he obviously made a few friends on his way to Atlantic. The first album came in 1949, and that was an album of poetry. It was called This Is My Beloved, and it was by Walter Benton. But in the early days, Atlantic Records was very much known for its doo-wop, R&B and jazz, and the artists had often recorded previously with other small labels without any real success. Atlantic's first real success story was Ruth Brown. She had her first R&B hit in the autumn of 1949 with a song called So Long, and then she had 24 R&B hits across the 1950s, including 5 R&B number ones. And in fact, Atlantic Records became known as the house that Ruth built. The Clovers were one of the early R&B vocal group successes, and they had their first R&B hit in the summer of 1951 with Don't You Know I Love You, and the writing credit went to Nugetre. That's spelled Nugetre, and that's actually Ahmet Ertegun's name, his surname, backwards. But he really did write that, and that wasn't always the case in the 1950s. It was quite commonplace for DJs and producers to add their names to the credit so that they could pick up the royalties for the songs. In fact, it became quite a scandal in the 1950s with payola, DJs taking payments for promoting songs and artists. And of course, DJ Alan Freed's career was completely destroyed by the payola scandal. Going back to the Clovers, they had the best part of a couple of dozen R&B hits across the 1950s. But only one of them became a crossover hit, Love, Love, Love. Another great singer on the Atlantic label was Big Joe Turner. His run of hits also started in 51 with Chains of Love, and he also had 20-odd R&B hits across the 50s. And he'd previously been on a couple of other labels and had small hits on National and Freedom labels. But the great song from him came in the May of 54 with Shake, Rattle and Roll. It gave him an R&B number 1. But the song itself goes into certainly the British rock and roll history books for a slightly different reason. It was on the 17th of December 1954 that Bill Haley and his Comets took the song Shake, Rattle and Roll into the UK charts, and that became the UK's first hit rock and roll single. One of the great names from that era was Ray Charles. He'd also been on a couple of other labels, had a couple of minor R&B hits on Downbeat and Swing Time. He cut his first single in 1952 on Atlantic, and his first R&B hit on the label came in 1954 with It Should Have Been Me. That song's not to be confused with the Yvonne Fair hit in 1976 with the same name. And interestingly, Ray Charles was actually a part of bluesman Lowell Fulson's touring band at the time. In early 1959, he recorded his classic song, What I Say, and the song has its origins in a live performance a couple of months earlier. It was late one evening and Ray Charles and his band had exhausted their repertoire. We've all done that, but still had time to go until the end of the set. So Charles turned to the others and told them to follow his lead. And what they did was a improvised first version of What I Say. Now, when he recorded the song, it was far too long for one side. And rather than edit it, Charles insisted they split it across both sides of the single. That was quite rare in those days. And shortly afterwards, Ray Charles left Atlantic and moved to ABC Paramount. But this is that song. This is Ray Charles with What I Say, Part 1. In 1953, Jerry Wexler joined Atlantic. He was brought in to replace Herb Abramson because he'd been drafted into the American Army. And in 1955, Ahmet's brother, Nesui, joined the record label. Now, he was a jazz expert, and Ahmet learned that he was planning to join Atlantic's big rival, Imperial, so Ahmet persuaded his brother to join him instead at Atlantic, which he did. And in 1955 also Herb Abramson returned from the army, but Jerry Wexler stayed on, and what they did at Atlantic, they set up the Atco label, and that was very much for Herb Abramson to run. Now, Leiber and Stoller have been very successful songwriters and producers in the early 1950s, and in 55 they also signed up with Atlantic in an independent production deal. Now, they'd previously owned a record label called Spark with Lester Sill, and of course Atlantic acquired that when Leiber and Stoller joined. And they'd also had a very successful band called the Robins, and when they moved to Atlantic, half of the Robins moved with them, and they called themselves the Coasters. Now, the Coasters had their first hit in the spring of 1956 with Down in Mexico. That was written by Leiber and Stoller. And then they had a string of hits on Atco up until the early 60s, and they included things like Charlie Brown and Poison Ivy, another big favourite with the 60s R&B and beat groups. But by 1962, things had soured between Leiber and Stoller and Atlantic Records. They had a big disagreement. Leiber and Stoller wanted formal production royalties and credits, so they moved on, and Atlantic filled the gap with Burt Burns. Well, a little known fact was that Phil Spector cut his teeth at Atlantic. He was there in 1960 and 61. He moved to New York in the summer of 1960 to work with Leiber and Stoller. And as well as learning his trade as a producer, he also worked as a session guitarist on a lot of the Atlantic singles. And he worked with bands like the Coasters, Benny King, the Drifters. And on the production side, he was also involved with Laverne Baker and Ruth Brown. And one of the earliest production credits he got was for a band called the Top Notes, and that was their original version of Twist and Shout, which is actually written by Burt Burns. Well, in 1961, Phil Spector left Atlantic and set up Phillies Records with Lester Sill. And Phil Spector's legendary Wall of Sound was born. Now, you'll recognise this next song, definitely from the Beatles, and a lot of people think it's an Isley Brothers original. But no, this is the Phil Spector produced original Top Notes version of Twist and Shout. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine and the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. And we're looking at the story of Atlantic Records. But in the meantime, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Just check out the link to the competition on my homepage at rockandrollunravelled.com, answer the simple question, and you're in the draw for a signed copy. Now, Rock and Roll Unravelled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk, and Record Collector magazine, in their review, described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Well, good luck with the competition, and meanwhile, back at the record label. Well, Atlantic was one of the main labels to transition 1950s R&B vocal groups and doo-wop vocal groups to 1960s soul music. Along with Motown, a lot of their original acts started out in R&B and doo-wop as well. Now, one of the really important vocal groups for Atlantic was the Drifters. And on the 7th of May 1953, Clyde McPhatter signed to Atlantic, and his mandate was to put a new vocal group together. He did just that. And in the October, their first single, Money Honey, gave them quite a big hit. It was an R&B #1 for 11 weeks. That's some debut single. It was credited as Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters, and they had 36 R&B hits into the mid-1960s. Their first crossover hit came in the summer of 1959 with There Goes My Baby, and they had 16 crossover hits in all. As well as the crossover in the sense of R&B chart to Billboard Top 40, they were also one of the very early crossovers from R&B to Atlantic Soul. Their first UK hit came in the January of 1960 with Dance With Me, and Ahmet Ertegun called them, and I quote, the all-time greatest Atlantic group. Well, that's some accolade. Now, the story of the Drifters is a fascinating one. A bit like Elvis Presley, there were very definitely three phases of the Drifters, and there was that early Drifters. But by May 1958, that particular version of the Drifters was on the way out. And what happened was that they were playing a gig at the Apollo, a week-long residency, and there was another band called the Crowns also playing that same residency for a week. And George Treadwell sacked the entire Drifters group at the end of that week and replaced them with the Crowns. Well, why on earth did he do that, I hear you ask? Well, George Treadwell was the Drifters manager, and he owned the rights to the Drifters name. Now, the Drifters had had a string of R&B hits stretching back to that Money Honey hit in 1953, but the last chart success they'd had was 9 months before this Apollo gig, and to make matters worse, the Drifters' lead singer, Bobby Hendricks, he'd parted company and moved off for a solo career. So George Treadwell's solution to this lack of hits was to take over the management of the Crowns and rebrand them, since he owned the name, as the Drifters. Well, he did just that. The new Drifters took to the road and fulfilled the obligations booked for the old Drifters. That must have been an interesting experience for the audiences. It was nearly a year before they were able to get into the studio to record their first single, There Goes My Baby, and along the way, lead singer of what was the Crowns was now the Drifters, Benjamin Earl Nelson. He decided to change his name, and he became Benny King. Well, it's around the same time that the sackings took place, in mid-58, Bill Pinkey, one of the original Drifters, formed a group he called the Original Drifters with other original members. And since then, there have been several Drifters lineups, often on the road simultaneously. I mean, these aren't tribute bands. These were, in effect, all portraying themselves as the Drifters. In the early 70s, the official Drifters relocated to the UK. Their hits had dried up in the US. Their last R&B hit was in 67. The last Billboard Top 40 was in 1964, time of the British invasion. I mean, that killed off an awful lot of 1950s American acts. They had their first UK hit in the March of 72, and that was At the Club and Saturday Night at the Movies. That was on the Atlantic label, and they had 11 more hits across the 1970s in the UK. But most of those were on the Bell label. Shortly after this hit, in 73, they moved from Atlantic to the Bell label. Now, this official version of the band is still on the road. Also, there's another version of the Drifters called Charlie Thomas's Drifters, and they're still gigging. Well, our next song gave Merseybeat band The Searchers their first hit, actually gave them a #1. But this is the original version. This is the Drifters with Sweet for My Sweet. On the 30th of June 1958, Bobby Darin entered the Billboard Top 40 with Splish Splash, and Atlantic had its first pop star. Now, this was an early stereo record, 1958. Interesting. He then had 17 hits on Atco, the last one being Things in the July of 1962, and he moved on to Capitol Records. Herb Abramson left Atlantic in the December of 1958, and Ahmet Ertegun replaced him as Atlantic's president. So now it was very much the three of them, Ahmet and Nisuai Ertegun and Jerry Wexler. Now for one of the strangest stories really in rock and roll history, the relationship between Stax and Atlantic Records. In 1959, Jerry Wexler contacted Jim Stewart at his record label Satellite, and Atlantic Records sorted out a distribution agreement with Satellite, and the deal was struck for $5,000. It was just on a handshake, nothing written down. A couple of these early releases, Carla and Rufus with 'Cause I Love You and Carla Thomas with Gee Whiz, were both released on Satellite and Atlantic. Now, Jerry Wexler really liked the vibe at the Satellite recording studios, and he sent his own Atlantic artists to record there. And then by mid-61, Satellite Records had actually changed its name and become Stax. And one of the early runners here was the Marquis, with their release Last Night. And on the Stax record label it says, distributed by Atlantic. Now, Steve Cropper and Donald Duck Dunn were both in the Marquis, and they became Booker T and the MGs, the house band at Stax. And in mid-62, they released the wonderful Green Onions. In 65, the Stax distribution contract was rewritten. This was because Jerry Wexler had told Jim Stewart that Atlantic might be sold, and their previous handshake deal really should be formalised. They should get it in writing. But sadly, Jim Stewart signed it without actually having his lawyers review it, because he trusted Jerry Wexler. And in 68, when Jim Stewart came to renegotiate the contract, he discovered that there was a clause in that 1965 contract that meant Atlantic owned all of the Stax material released while the distribution agreement had been in place. So in 1965 he signed away the entire Stax back catalogue for $1. Apparently Jerry Wexler didn't know about this clause. Well, one of the big favourites on the Stax label, of course, was Sam and Dave. And in 1967 they had a hit on both sides of the Atlantic. It actually gave them an R&B #1 for 7 weeks. And this is Sam and Dave and Soul Man. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine and the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. And this is the Atlantic record story. Now, lots of the bands and artists mentioned in the show have tours and venues actually in the diary now. And to check out this latest tour information, just go to my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. And at the top you'll see something called 1960s, 1970s Artists Touring Now. I mentioned that the official Drifters and Charlie Thomas's Drifters are still gigging. So just check my website out to see exactly where you can see them in the coming months. Well, back to Atlantic Records. Ray Charles and Bobby Darin moved on. They left the label in the early 1960s, and Solomon Burke filled the gap. His first single in the autumn of 1961, Just Out of Reach, gave him a #7 R&B hit. And he had 19 R&B hits on Atlantic across the 1960s, and they included some fabulous songs, Cry to Me, If You Need Me, and the wonderful Everybody Needs Somebody to Love. Now there are a host of soul legends on Atlantic and the associated labels. In the spring of 63, you could hear Otis Redding's first single, These Arms of Mine, and that was on the Vault label, another one of these associated Atlantic labels. Well, sadly, of course, Otis Redding died on the 10th of December 1967, and as is often the case, he had his only #1 shortly after that with Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. That was actually his 22nd R&B hit on either the Vault, mostly on the Vault, and a couple on the Stax label. Eddie Floyd was around in the middle of 1966 with Knock on Wood, another R&B #1, and Sam and Dave, Hold On I'm Coming, in the autumn of 66. That was their second R&B hit, and it was their first R&B #1. But in 1968, of course, after the relationship with Stax soured, Hold On I'm Coming was released on Stax, they switched from the Stax label back to the Atlantic label. After some limited success at Columbia, Aretha Franklin joined Atlantic in the spring of 1967 with her first single, I Never Loved a Man. Ooh, that gave her an R&B #1 for 7 weeks. And she had 51 hits on Atlantic before she moved to Arista in 1979. And Wilson Pickett, of course, one of the stalwarts of the 60s soul sounds. Now, he had a fabulous single called I Found Love when he was with the Falcons back in 62. I mean, it was on the Lupine label. It was actually distributed by Atlantic Records, but that's not why I mention it. I mention it because it's a fantastic single. And if you like this sort of music, definitely check it out. I've played it on the show before. Wilson Pickett's first single on Atlantic, I'm Gonna Cry, was in the middle of 1964, but it was a year later that his very, very famous In the Midnight Hour gave him his first hit on Atlantic. That was recorded at Stax, and it was written by Wilson Pickett and Steve Cropper. Now, there's this wonderful urban myth about the song, and it goes that Jerry Wexler put Wilson Pickett and Steve Cropper in a room with a bottle of Jack Daniels and told them to write. Well, they did, and that was the result. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's a great story. Now, if you went to a dance hall in the mid-1960s, as I did, you could guarantee that the band on stage would play this at some point in their set. But this is the original version. This is Wilson Pickett with In the Midnight Hour. In the mid-1960s, the British invasion was coming to an end. That was when the British bands were dominating the American music scene. And a whole new generation of rock music artists emerged in America. And of course, Atlantic Records embraced this new generation of rock. It also marked another change for Atlantic. The R&B and soul artists tended to score more on the Billboard R&B Top 40, but the rock artists were very much on the mainstream Billboard Top 40. In 1965, you had Sonny and Cher with I Got You, Babe, and the Young Rascals, I Ain't Gonna Eat Out My Heart Anymore. Young Rascals became known as Blue-Eyed Soul, and that's very much where white artists were singing soul music. Righteous Brothers were another great example of Blue-Eyed Soul. But going back to the Young Rascals, they had a couple of #1s with Good Lovin' and Groovin'. And in 1967, Buffalo Springfield released their protest anthem, For What It's Worth, and that was inspired by the Sunset Strip protests, stroke riots. Also in 1967, you had Cream with I Feel Free, and the Bee Gees with New York Mining Disaster. Well, there were some changes in the second half of the 1960s to the Atlantic organisation. Warner 7 Arts Corporation took over Atlantic and ACCO and sort of combined them with their Warner Brothers and Reprise, but operated as separate record companies, and that was a $17 million deal. And in 1969, the Kinney Corporation bought Warner 7 Arts. The Kinney Corporation were keen to diversify into the entertainment business, but they brought Warner Brothers and Atlantic back together. In 1969, Led Zeppelin released their first album in America. That was actually 10 weeks before the UK release. Their manager, Peter Grant, had flown over to America to do a deal with Atlantic, and do a deal he did. Also in 1969, Crosby, Stills and Nash released Marrakesh Express. Now, it's quite an interesting story behind that. Stephen Stills' manager, David Geffen, had wanted to buy out his contract at Atlantic so they could form Crosby, Stills and Nash. But when he went to talk to Ahmet Ertegun, always the consummate businessman, he persuaded Geffen that it would be far better to bring Crosby, Stills and Nash to Atlantic than to take Stephen Stills away. And at the end of 1969, of course, the Allman Brothers released their first album. But for our next music, we're going back to the Young Rascals and a little bit of Blue-Eyed Soul from their first album. And this is I Ain't Gonna Eat Out My Heart Anymore. Well, there were some more company changes in 1970 when the Kinney Corporation purchased Elektra and they established WEA, Warner Elektra Atlantic. Now, the record divisions established their own distribution branches for each major region of America. Previously, it had been independents who handled the distribution, but this now put them on a level with the likes of Columbia and RCA. Kinney eventually became Warner Communications and operated as three divisions, all in competition with each other. Well, as the 70s rolled on, we had some debut singles on Atlantic, and various associated labels, of course, from some great people, including King Crimson within the Court of the Crimson King, Yes with Sweetness, Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Lucky Man, and Genesis with what became the final album with Peter Gabriel, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And in a slightly more pop vein, ABBA gave us Waterloo. By 76, AC/DC had joined Atlantic, and they released It's a Long Way to the Top, coupled with High Voltage, and the sound of bagpipes there. As the 70s rolled into the 80s, Atlantic was now releasing music from In Excess, Skid Row, Rush, and on really, and on into the 90s and beyond. Well, from 1950s doo-wop and R&B to 1960s soul and 1970s rock, this has been the Atlantic record story. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show and the story of Atlantic Records. I hope you enjoyed listening to the show, half as much as I've been putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unravelled. Remember, you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Simply go to my website homepage, rockandrollunraveled.com, and click on the link to the competition. I'll post the signed copy of the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Well, good luck with the competition, and join me again next time for another look at some rock and roll unravelled. Well, to play us out, Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Lucky Man.